what is required for a child to learn is not just the child, but the teacher, the entire education system, the resources, the teaching learning material which is available. So the environment or the ecosystem within a school, within a classroom, all play a huge part in whether or not the child is able to learn. And if there is not a supportive environment, then I genuinely believe whether a child comes from a low-income community or a mid-income or a high-income community, without a supportive environment, with a committed teacher, with a committed setup which allows the child to thrive, fundamentally no child can learn.
Hello and welcome to a very special podcast series, Unusual Suspects. I'm your host, Gaurav Chaudhary. This is a series about unraveling stories of entrepreneurs, investors, and businesses, and of course, professionals who are disruptors, yet not in your face. Their disruptions have consistently delivered on the purpose and the mission they've embarked on. Their values are as strong as the mission. While they're ruthless in pursuing their ambition, they don't stray from being leaders who are not just admired for their vision and relentless pursuit, but also for how they're building an ecosystem of believers who consistently push the boundaries. They allow principles to take precedence over ad hocism. For them, profitability is as important as scale, creating and leading new categories and innovations. In each episode, I speak to one such leader, talking to her or him or them about their businesses, lives, careers, inspirations, work, interests, challenges, pivot moments and turning points, successes, failures, and of course, the little joys of life. It is as much about their personal life stories as about their professional journeys. Unusual Suspects streams on Earshot.in, Spotify.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, moneycontrol.com, and a host of other podcast streaming platforms. For this episode, I'm delighted to have Shaveta Sharma-Kukreja, the CEO and Managing Director at Central Square Foundation. She has been part of the founding team at CSF since 2012. Shaveta leads CSF's work on FLN, Foundational Literacy and Numeracy, Early Childhood Education, and EdTech, and oversees the organization's institution building. She is passionate to bring to life CSF's vision of quality learning for all children and government-led system reforms for scale and sustainability. Shaveta is on the advisory board of Language and Learning Foundation, LLF, Madhi Foundation, and Sarthi Education. She is also on the advisory board of Indian Leaders of Social Sector, in line with the commitment for high quality leadership for the social sector. Now, the passion area for her is gender, and she is a founding mentor to the Udeti Foundation that is working on women economic empowerment. Prior to CSF, she worked at the Boston Consulting Group and the Citibank, among others. Welcome to Unusual Suspect, Shaveta. Delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you, Gaurav.
Shaveta, the challenge, let's start off with a very basic question, but very fundamental though. The challenge to make children learn while seeming straightforward seems to be rather daunting, and that is something that we probably don't realize because it's too close to our lives. And let's quote some data here. Recent data in India shows that almost 100% GER, or Gross Enrolment Ratio, for children aged group 3 to 10 years. This is very encouraging because as a headline number, this is very encouraging and probably comparable with the best in the world. But somehow this kind of masks a glaring gap, and somehow the data on learning basic skills among children hasn't kept pace. What, in your opinion, and you have been a practitioner in this space for quite some time, and you know this sector like the back of your palms, what, in your opinion, is the first step to ensure that attending school can equal learning? Shaveta?
We are starting with a very basic question to even understand why in India as a country, when all our children are in school, there is still a gap at learning levels. Gaurav, I always like to start any conversation about the Indian education system to first give some numbers for all our listeners to understand the context in which we are having this conversation. India has one of the largest education systems. We have about 26.5 crore students who go to 15 lakh schools and are taught by 95 lakh teachers. If we look at primary grades, 1 in every 6 child studying in a primary grade in the world is an Indian child. Adding to the sheer size is the complexity of languages. We are a diverse country and children learn in different languages. Education reform in India has always had a very vibrant journey. Whether it's Operation Blackboard and district primary education programs that started in 80s to the Right to Education Act, India has had an incredible journey in making sure all our children are coming to school. And even after COVID, we are almost close to 100% enrollment rates for primary grades, which is children in grades 1 to 8. However, the challenge is that almost all efforts were towards inputs and infrastructure. So the focus has been on building schools, the focus has been on enrollment, the focus has been with incredible programs like midday meal for keeping children to school. However, in all of this, the due focus that needed to be put on learning outcomes got ignored. And because it wasn't getting measured, it wasn't getting the due attention, it wasn't getting adequately done. Most of us who are a product of the Indian education system, the first time learning outcomes become significant, and in fact, learning outcomes is not the right word, but the first time how well you're doing in school becomes relevant is grade 10 and grade 12 board exams. But that's very late in a child's education journey. If we are not able to support the child's learning when she's young and starting her education journey, then it's a long road ahead with gaps in learning levels, which no level of remediation can support. So we've had a good, solid history, a lot of investment from government towards strengthening the education system. But because they've gotten limited to inputs, with a lack of focus on quality of learning, coming to school being equated to learning is something which is still elusive for the Indian education system.
Absolutely. Very well said and very well articulated. You've broken down the problem in a manner that it exists and the way it should be probably addressed. That brings me to the second question, which is, it's always very easy for us and rather tempting, if I may say so, to put this and straitjacket it into a linear binary kind of a problem, which essentially would mean that children do not acquire the skills because of a lack of proper learning environment and child's attention span. And if you bucket this problem as a binary function, of course, then you end up actually judging children's intelligence levels, or rather, shall I say, the lack of it. Isn't, in your view, the issue much more multidimensional than we actually make it out to be, Shaveta?
Oh, most absolutely, Gaurav. I genuinely believe every child has the capability and the capacity to learn. However, they all might not learn in the same way, in the same time, on the same day. And of course, we have to acknowledge there could be cognitive, non-cognitive challenges that some children might need support from. But a child's learning is not dependent only on the child's inherent ability to learn. There is a cross section of issues which sometimes go even beyond education, which needs to be factored in. So, for example, there are home factors being important. The child's own health and nutrition becomes important. But if I was to still answer your question specifically in the context of the school education system, it's what is required for a child to learn is not just the child, but the teacher, the entire education system, the resources, the teaching learning material which is available. So the environment or the ecosystem within a school, within a classroom, all play a huge part in whether or not the child is able to learn. And if there is not a supportive environment, then I genuinely believe whether a child comes from a low-income community or a mid-income or a high-income community, without a supportive environment, with a committed teacher, with a committed setup which allows the child to thrive, fundamentally no child can learn.
Yes, of course, every child can learn, and it's going to be very naive to actually conclude that it's a function of children's intelligence levels and also the attention span. I think it would then tantamount to oversimplifying the problem. But if you look at global data, for instance, and if you look at what the World Bank has put out, and global data on learning levels from the World Bank indicate that the problem of lack of learning in the classroom is much more severe in low and middle income countries. And India is now a lower middle income country within the World Bank categorization. So in India, it is said that 56 out of 100 children are unable to read a simple text by the age of 10. And this number was more severe during the pandemic, and obviously so. In your experience of working with state governments, particularly who are at the front line of imparting education in India, what steps are they taking to address this learning crisis? Because it's a crisis of enormous proportions that we just don't tend to acknowledge. And what practical measures are required to address this and stem this learning loss? Shaveta?
Yes, Gaurav, let me pick up from the statistic you quoted from the World Bank. So the World Bank has this metric that they define as learning poverty, which is basically if a 10-year-old child cannot read with meaning, as in read to understand, she is called learning poor. Very unfortunately, India is pegged at 56%, which I strongly believe is, it's a point of concern for all of us collectively as a country. For a country with strong economic aspirations, where we want to tap into our human capital dividend, we have to nurture that human capital. The positive news is that India, from a policy perspective, has strongly prioritized the need to focus on quality learning. So while schools were shut during COVID and the learning crisis deepened in many ways for our children, India came out with a national education policy in 2020, which actually said that the country needs to radically prioritize early learning, that we have to make sure our young children learn because that forms the base of the education system. Not only did the country prioritize early learning in the policy, after that, the central government Ministry of Education rolled out an early learning mission for India called Nipun Bharat. It's the mission for foundational literacy and numeracy. Gaurav, foundational literacy means reading with meaning, reading to understand, and numeracy means 4 arithmetic functions, plus, minus, multiply, and divide. Nipun Bharat Mission set out the ambitious goal that over a 5-year period, the country is committed to making sure all our children achieve their FLN competencies. Basically, all our children learn to read. Because when these children grow into higher grades, grades 4, 5, middle school and onwards, even to the age that you and I are, we now read to learn. So we have to solve for the learning to read. Nipun Bharat Mission has dedicated funding of about 2,400 crore every year. And this funding is not for additional hiring of staff within the education system. The clarity with which the Nipun Bharat Mission lays out guidelines of how young children need to be supported for learning shows up in how the funding is being allocated. There is 500 rupees per student being made available for additional teaching learning material. Because while a child might be able to read physics and economics from a book, for a young child to learn language and arithmetic, you need additional teaching learning resources. There is 150 rupees available per teacher for the state governments to design teacher guides, which are lesson plans to assist the teachers in teaching. There's funding of about 24 lakh available at each district level in the country for districts to monitor how their district, how all schools and students are doing on foundational literacy and numeracy. So I actually feel quite proud that India has acknowledged the challenge, prioritized the need for foundational literacy and numeracy in the new education policy, which has huge political and bureaucratic support in our country, and state governments have adopted Nipun Bharat Mission, given it their own local contextual flavors to tap into the funding which is being made available to ensure our children are in school, have the right support mechanism, both for students and teachers for learning.
It's good that you talk about the policies focus and what the government has been doing. And so let's turn the lens a bit on something that is very recent, the National Education Policy 2020, NEP 2020. And clearly the government has got its focus absolutely right so far as the policy is concerned, because it has, NEP 2020 has clearly accorded the highest priority to achieving FLN by all students by grade 3. And it has set a goal of achieving universal FLN in primary school by 2025, which is effectively next year, which the policy says needs to be carried out on mission mode. Since you are at the forefront of this and you are the front line of executing this as a practitioner, how far do you think are we from achieving this, Shaveta?
before I respond, just a small correction. Nipun Bharat got launched in 2021 for 5 years.
Yeah.
And
Right.
because the schools were closed due to COVID, like, we achieved our first steady academic year only in 22. The mission goes
Absolutely.
on till 2026-27. So currently,
That's right. So the target years have been reset a bit. But having said that, how far do you think are we from achieving this?
So I would say we are off to a very strong start. And I am basing this on not just the continued engagement and prioritization I see the central government putting for Nipun Bharat mission, but even more importantly, from the work that we are seeing states do. As Central Square Foundation, we support 11 state governments on their FLN missions. And I know that states where CSF might not be working directly, we know in the ecosystem, there are partner organizations, other NGOs or civil society organizations, which have been working very closely with the departments of education. So almost all states have adopted Nipun Bharat and given its own local flavor. They have designed teaching learning material, teacher training, set up monitoring and assessment system with clarity of goals to monitor the progress. I would say we are on to a very solid start. And Gaurav, if I may, maybe I can mention a few states where we've directly been working. In fact, Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh are two states that CSF started working in 2019. And these states took a very pioneering view to foundational literacy and numeracy, even ahead of NEP and Nipun Bharat. So UP adopted the FLN goal as Mission Prerna in 2019. Madhya Pradesh adopted it as Mission Ankur. The states continued to work on the design, even through COVID, while they were trying to figure out how do we reach children at school, in the communities, get teaching learning material and textbooks at home. Because for most children coming to government school, online resources are limited. UP since then adopted, in a way, renamed Mission Prerna to become Nipun Uttar Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh continues to call it Mission Ankur, whether it's Nipun Haryana, which is the FLN mission in Haryana. Where I see very strong progress is on 4 dimensions. Just the salience of the mission. It's not something that the department is doing amongst the many other things they are doing. States have got political support, right, at the chief minister's level, at the education minister's level, talking about the need for making sure our children are Nipun in terms of their learning. Second, the Department of Education and SCRT, which is the State Council of Education, Research and Training, have done a critical review of what their own academic inputs are. Around this time is also when India came up with the National Curriculum Framework for Foundational Stages. So with an open mind on the need for what is missing in the program that our children are not being able to learn, what new solutions need to be embedded, whether it's teaching learning resources, whether it's training our teachers, states have adopted strong inputs. And because it's a government-funded program, all these inputs are not being piloted in a set of schools. These inputs are reaching every school, every government school in the state. And to me, that's the power of a government-run mission. States have then made sure that when there's clarity on the goal, there's rich resources available, teachers are being trained, they are being supported to adopt the curriculum, the instruction design, making sure the system is set up with the capacity it needs. And not limiting it to teachers, but other education funds, whether it's resource people at a block level, cluster level, district level, our headmasters. And the last dimension is ensuring there is accountability and setting up monitoring system. We have supported 8 state governments in running their own state assessments, where they have got people outside the school to come and actually do an evaluation of children to establish what the learning levels are. And this razor sharp focus that we need our children to be Nipun competent, let's measure what the baseline of learning is. Let's make sure the resources are available to our students, to our teachers in our classrooms, and together take accountability for crossing that line. I wish I had data to share right now, but I'm quite confident actually that within the next quarter, we'll see some very promising results coming from state missions based on data that they have collected and they are taking full accountability for. So off to a good start, and I'm quite optimistic that the next 3 academic years of the mission will actually see us deliver learning outcomes for all our children.
Absolutely. No, Shaveta, it's good that you mention about the power of state government-run missions. And CSF has been actively working with various state governments on addressing learning gaps in foundational learning for more than a decade now. And you did mention about Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh as an illustration. So much so that 65% of children studying in government schools in primary grades are in the states being supported by CSF, and that's a very creditable number. What has been, if I may ask so, been the most valued learning for CSF in this journey? Has there been any learning that probably you were not aware of and only got to know once you have started executing this alongside state governments? What are the aspects and the facets that were kind of, thrown up new challenges and also probably surprised you on the pleasant and the positive side?
I'll maybe talk about three particular aspects, and I won't fully say that, we were totally surprised, but I saw all of these become very real when we worked so deeply with, state governments. I think one is theoretically, Gaurav, the sector always talks about design for scale. You can't design for a lab, you can't design for a pilot and assume it will scale up. One of the analogy we internally use is that just because you put together a good show flat doesn't mean the same capability is all that's required to put up a condominium building, right? The show flat shows you what's possible, but you have to think of when you're converting it into a 50-story skyscraper, what it will require. And I think for us, the fact that we approached FLN with states with the clarity that the intent is not to pilot it in a district. The intent is not to run a lab school and show what's possible. Helped us make very conscious decisions and choices with the government on what will work for every child and every teacher in that state. And I genuinely believe that while we've seen a lot of successful NGO pilots, they don't always stick in the system, they don't always scale, because we are trying to take a pilot idea everywhere without having factored in what are the aspects which need to be kept in mind in the design. So I think the fact that you have to partner with the government from day one and think scale and sustainability in every design element has been a great learning. Second, we always talk about data or sometimes lack of data, and also that not all data that the education system has might be reliable. But I've had huge respect for the honesty with which the government system is actually looking for reliable data, whether it's at a learning outcome level, whether it's how good a teacher training workshop ran, whether it's to track attendance. There is acknowledgement that we need to be more sharply focused on metrics, and we need to make sure that the system is incentivized to give us reliable data. Gaurav, if I feel my incentive is to always come back to you with the good news, is only when I tend to start inflating the data. But if as a system we collectively take responsibility for, we know we are not where we need to be. We have a long journey ahead. But let's make sure we have the dashboard, we have the metrics. I mean, as a sector, it was very heartening to see the Honorable Prime Minister talk about a metric called oral reading fluency. This was in December 2021. ORF is basically the speed with which a child reads. It's measured in correct words per minute. Having the leader of the nation talk about that under Nipun Bharat and why it's important that we as a country focus on how well our children are learning towards building an Atmanirbhar Bharat. And now, whichever state government, whichever school you walk into, having that knowledge, having that muscle memory on why fluency is important. And I'm giving example of one metric, right? There's a scaffolding of metrics to be able to get the children to be able to read the meaning. But just from a country, again, I'll go back to, right, where children were known based on what their 10th grade percentage is. Now we are able to support a young child in her learning on where she is, where she needs to be, and how do we help her cover that gap while she is in the same grade. So the focus on data, the focus on what's the right metric, how do we get reliable data has been very heartening to see. And the third is, I think, a continuing journey for us, Gaurav, right now. At the end of the day, the strongest policies, the strongest missions with adequate funding and resources will only turn into real learning impact for our children in the hands of our teachers. And I think now the work needs to be done on practice, on behavior change, on adoption. whether it's for our parents to join the mission with the full energy of saying, I am taking responsibility of ensuring my child is in school regularly. Parents and communities influence attendance. For teachers to adopt the new teaching learning resources, whether it's lesson plan, whether it's workbooks, and make that a part of their daily practice, is when the intent of NEP, the intent of Nipun Bharat, the intent of any state mission will actually turn into a reality in every classroom, and we'll see our children learning. And I think this third part is what we as CSF are focused on. We have now also started directly working at a district level, setting up a small project management team at a district level to work across stakeholders, from the chief development officer, district education officer, block education officers, teachers, and the community, to ensure the intended high quality inputs actually come together in the classroom practice, where teachers are able to use them effectively, teachers enjoy in how they are teaching it, and we are all able to tangibly see our children.
It's good that you say that, because as a country, we are wrongly and incorrectly obsessed with board exam results, and that's an approach that's a legacy focus that we just refuse to, or have not been able to shrug off. Whereas in the NEP 2020, in contrast, mandates a robust system of continuous formative, adaptive, and summative assessment to track and which will obviously lead to individualization of each student's learning. As a practitioner, what's your opinion on this, Shaveta?
Gaurav, I'm so glad that you've brought out this particular aspect of the new education policy, especially in today's time, when we are, on one hand, we are talking of India still hasn't achieved competency on foundational literacy and numeracy. On the other hand, we are also acknowledging how machine learning, AI, and generative AI is changing the world we live in. We don't know what jobs will exist tomorrow. It is so important to make sure what we are building for our children is their skills and competencies. And that cannot adequately be captured only in exams, only with a particular grade. The NEP has been very ambitious in stating that out, that it's important to make sure that children are becoming competent. We are not just, in a rush to complete a syllabus and test our children on that. It will be a long journey. I do want to acknowledge the intent and ambitious is inspiring. The intent and ambition is inspiring. But to be able to step away from a rote-based curriculum, to acknowledge that we need to be talking skills, competencies, learning outcomes, is a transition that we collectively as a country need to make. Our education system needs to make, our parents need to make, our teachers need to make. And in fact, in the work that we have done as Central Square Foundation for FLN, one of the things that I feel most heartened about is to actually be able to talk in terms of the learning outcome frame. I'll again go back to where I quoted ORF as an example, right? There are sub-skills that a child needs to develop to be able to become FLN competent. And until we are not able to break down those sub-skills, design resources for that, train our teachers to support that, then, in a way, we are shooting in the dark and hoping just finishing the syllabus will get the children to learn. So inspiring and ambitious call out by the NEP, I think it sets us on the right path, but we still have a long distance to cover.
That's very true, because, this is a significant departure from the existing and what it's dominated by the attendance-driven and very unfortunately one-size-fits-all approach that we currently have, which is what is that resulted in. That has resulted in very heavy dependence on rote learning, and the NEP is making an attempt to actually turn it around, which is trying to make it more outcome-based, and through specific hours daily, as also regular dedicated events over the years on activities involving various subjects. Now, the key thing here, however, is that in any child's education journey, the teachers are one of the most important constituents in this process, and all of us tend to underrate this because the focus is always on the child. So their teaching and their education programs need to be reformulated, even as we probably, it's one thing to change the early grade curriculum, but those who are imparting that curriculum are those that needs to be actually trained, and because they're the ones who's carrying the torch there. they will need to be redesigned. For teachers training, programs also need to be redesigned appropriately, with a very, very strong emphasis on FLN. How is this playing out in the States, Shaveta?
Gaurav, again, I'm glad you brought out a very, very important aspect on what will it take for all our children to learn. And the focus cannot only be on our children. We need to make sure our teachers are trained, supported, oriented, and brought on board as the actual change agents to make all of this possible. Uh, and hence, one of the things that I mentioned earlier in our conversation was the focus that all the states that we are working with, and is true of all other states in the country, on teacher training. India has always prioritized teacher training. What I am now seeing with Nippon is making sure the training is for those particular teaching learning materials. Teachers are being oriented and onboarded to the vision of new education policy, to the vision of Nippon Bharat, and then being trained on all the inputs which are available to them under the state Nippon mission, whether it's additional teaching learning material in terms of daily lesson plans, workbooks, library books, math manipulatives, all teaching learning resources, assessments. And states are not just doing this in the typical face-to-face training that they plan for at the start of the academic year, but how do we tap into the fact that almost every government school teacher today has access to a smartphone, which we leveraged during COVID? How do we support that one-time training for Nippon with digital support through the year and also make it demand-based? As a teacher, I might get oriented to what I need to do for Nippon for language faster than I do for math. So I should be able to have the option of on demand on my training need, be able to get that support. So face-to-face digital support, making it on demand, and also making sure teachers are supported for their role. Typically, when education functionaries go to school, it's viewed as a visit for inspection, that they're here to collect data, they're here to find some fault. How do we reorient the system for these visits to be academic in nature? The intent of the resource persons to be to coach, to mentor, to support. And in states that we work, it's very heartening to see the numbers of visits whether it's academic resource people, cluster academic coordinators, not only are they going to schools, they're going into classrooms, they're observing classrooms, they're doing a quick spot assessment with a couple of children to really see whether or not the children are learning, where the gaps are, capturing this feedback and sitting down with the teacher and discussing this feedback. So it's important that teachers are not just onboarded into the mission, but they become our champions to take this mission forward in every classroom.
Absolutely. Shaveta, finally, how can one make learning and numeracy taught to children in the classroom extend beyond the textbooks and be made relatable with daily examples from their households? So in this context, what steps is CSF taking to ensure learning at home using technology-aided learning solutions is incorporated into the learning journey of a child, Shaveta?
Gaurav, we firmly believe, and I think we all of us also experience, learning is integrated. Of course, for a young child, especially from a low-income community, majority of that learning time is achieved in school, but it's very important to make sure it's in the context of the child. So in terms of teaching learning resources, how do we make sure that the math manipulatives are things that are locally available? For example, we can teach counting by using Rajma, by matchsticks, by pebbles. They don't only have to be sophisticated marbles or counting blocks. Stories on literacy, because when we begin with the child getting familiar with language, should be about the local context. Let's not talk about pizza. Let's talk about a roti. Let's not talk about an aeroplane. Let's talk about a horse cart. And in addition to that, how do we get additional teaching learning time for the children at home? There are reports, whether it's the ASER report, which did a beyond basic study and saw that the number of households who have access to smartphones has doubled from 2018 to 2020, from 36% to about 75%. CSF conducted a primary research across 6,000 households in 6 states called the Bharat Survey for EdTech, base 2023, where we found that 70% households have access to smartphones, and children are using those devices. The Ghar Ka phone shared device is available to the child for learning. How do we now make sure appropriate digital teaching learning resources are reaching the child for home learning? And I'll go back to the word I started with. It has to be integrated. If I'm a semi-literate parent with high ambition for my child, you can't expect me to navigate the edtech world and figure out what's the right solution. But if there is a solution which is anchored to what's being taught in school, which is coming via the teacher, then I will definitely be very invested in making sure the child is able to borrow the phone, whether it's the father's phone or increasingly even mothers have access to smartphones, to be able to revise, practice. If there is a particular skill the child has not been able to learn, can that at-home learning digital solution become a supplementary resource? And we do feel that, again, India's digital advantage, the behavior of spending time on the device, whether children might only be doing it for entertainment right now, but that can be tapped into making sure additional teaching learning time is available for all children. The home learning further supports the in-class learning to make sure our children are able to build those competencies in a timely manner in the appropriate grades.
Thank you, Shaveta, for sharing your deep insights and perspective and taking the time out to share this conversation and your insights with us and having this conversation and take part in this podcast. Thank you so much, Shaveta.
I enjoyed the conversation, Gaurav. My privilege to join you today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.